You've been hearing us talk about imperial yeast for a while now, and that's because we absolutely love this stuff. With 200 billion cells in each pitch-right pouch, we rarely even need to make starters these days. Unfortunately, not everybody has the access to imperial yeast those of us out here on the West Coast do, because they're based out of Portland, Oregon. But things are about to change. Imperial Yeast is excited to announce the opening of their East Coast location, which is huge for those who want the freshest yeast possible with the best pitch rates, but brew on the other side of the country. They're going to start by offering their four most popular strains, A38 Juice, A07 Flagship, L13 Global, and Go3 Dieter, with the goal of providing their full lineup of yeast by mid-2021. So start your planning now at imperialyeast.com. For as wonderful as beer is, there are a number of things that can go awry throughout the brewing process, which ultimately lead to the development of off flavors. Those who have experience judging beer in competitions or sharing beer with other brewers are no doubt very well aware of the number of different off flavors that can be in beer, as well as their associated descriptors. This is the Brewlosophy Podcast. I'm your host, Marshall Schott, and joining me on this episode to discuss our experiences with beer off flavors is contributor Cade Jobe.
Yeah, this was going to be a lot of fun. We're going to go over a lot of off flavors in this episode. So I think it's like 12 or 13 that we're going to hit here, which is fantastic. But, it's going to be a little bit, not a super in-depth look at each of the off flavors, but maybe focus a little bit more on our experiences with the off flavor, which I think is going to be a really fun sort of take for this. Now, we'll hit, of course, what it is, where it comes from, and that kind of stuff. But that's the thing that I want to share, and I hope you want to share as well, Marshall, is our experience with those things, with these off flavors.
Exactly. We have episodes where we've focused specifically on one or two different off flavors and really dug into those and the experiments where we dosed beers with them. That's not what this episode is. This is an experience episode, meaning that we're going to discuss our experiences with these off flavors that are very well known, often brought up at beer evaluations or homebrew club meetings. And part of the reason, one of the impetuses behind this is that after making comments on this show about the way we perceive certain off flavors that maybe differ from what others have heard or read about, I've gotten a lot of feedback, actually, of people saying, we'd love to hear more about your guys' specific experience with those off flavors. And so, Cade, you actually had brought something up. We decided to make an entire experience episode out of it. Again, we are going to be going through off flavors relatively quickly because we don't want to dig too deep into them. We're just going to talk a little bit about how they are created, what you can do to avoid them, and how we have perceived them in our own things. Now, if you've been listening to the show long enough, you've likely heard us question the accuracy with which people are capable of detecting certain off flavors as well. So we're also going to be touching on things like that and what we think. That's one of the more fun parts of it for me, to be honest, Cade, is like
me too.
What I think people are mistaking certain off flavors for. Again, we just want to have a little bit of fun going over these things a little bit more lightheartedly. So this is going to be a fun one. Well, if you are a fan of this show and you'd like to receive a reward for your support, consider becoming a patron of Brewlosophy over at patreon.com/Brewlosophy, where you can make a small pledge and receive rewards like access to unpublished contributor recipes, unique discounts at YakimaValleyHops.com, and an invite to a monthly live Q&A session with somebody in the brewing world. Coming up next month, June of 2021, is Mike Myers. No, not that Mike Myers, from Loveland, Colorado's Root Shoot Malting, a craft maltster producing an incredibly tasty array of brewing malts. Contributor Jake Houlihan has been obsessed with this stuff for the last couple of years, and the beers that I've tried that were made with Root Shoot malts have been so good. It's awesome to see the growth of these smaller craft maltsters. If you agree or have anything you'd like to ask somebody in that industry, be sure to make your pledge at patreon.com/Brewlosophy by Friday, June 25th, 2021. All past sessions are stored on our private Facebook page, so patrons can go back and watch them whenever they like. Again, that's patreon.com/Brewlosophy. And another really easy way to support us is by using the links found at brewlosophy.com/support when shopping online. Your shopping experience doesn't change at all, and we get a little kickback for the referral. All right, feedback is brought to you by Brewers Hardware, who offer brewers beautiful stainless gear, such as the turnkey BH15 Pilot Brewing System, which has a hard plumb manifold to eliminate all hosing changes during the brew process. Brewers Hardware has a ton of unique purpose-built products useful to both professionals and home brewers. Go see for yourself at brewershardware.com, and don't forget to mention Brewlosophy at checkout to receive a free gift. That's brewershardware.com. Jason from North Carolina wrote in to say, I've heard several references to kegs naturally purged with CO2, and I think I have a clue of what you're talking about. However, I can't find an article or podcast episode covering it. Do you have something you could point to that would help me see what you're doing here? I really dig what you guys are doing. Thanks. Jason, yes, we actually do have an article on the process titled Using CO2 from Fermentation to Purge Serving Kegs. If you just go search that in Google or at brewlosophy.com, you'll very easily find that article where I go in detail about how I do that. It's not I don't think it's a proprietary thing that I've created. I know other people out there were probably doing it before we did, but we wrote it up in the way that I've been doing it, and it works incredibly well. What Jason's talking about here, by the way, is capturing the CO2 during fermentation and using it to push star sand, solution out of one keg and into another one so that you're naturally purging a keg. We also covered this method in episode 93 of the Brewlosophy podcast. Again, like this episode, it was a part of the exBEERience series where we talked about the various ways we go about reducing cold side oxidation.
Yeah, that one's a fun one. And this is something that I really want to do myself at some point in the future. But right now with my brew bucket set up, it's pretty easy for me to just, connect the everything to CO2. So that's just always blanketed by CO2. And then I have a separate setup that I use for kegs that I just purge the CO2 out of those kegs before packaging. But yeah, I mean, this is a really cool way to harvest CO2, right? I mean, you've got all of this, byproduct of fermentation that's just sort of floating out into the air or into your, fermentation chamber. Why not take advantage of that? And I think that's a really cool way to do it. So this is a really cool method. And I think it's one that more people should try. Like I said, one that I might try eventually in the future if my setup changes.
Yeah, it's super easy. I mean, it took me so long to come up with this idea. Now I do it most of the time, and I love it. So hopefully that helps you, Jason. If you have show feedback, you can send it to feedback@brewlosophy.com or drop us a note on social media. Likely knowing how much my friends and I enjoy clean, crisp, crushable pale lager, listener Zach Otting sent me an American lager he made with 70% pale malt and 15% each of corn and rice. He said it was 1045 OG and finished at a very dry 1005 FG after being fermented at traditional lager temperatures.
1 minute beer review with Jersey and Tim.
Cheers to my best friend Timmy.
No smell.
That means it's going to be good. Or you've got COVID.
It's clean?
It's clean. It's crisp. It's smooth. It's light. That's what we like, dog. We do not like big flavors.
I like it.
It's almost too light.
Yeah, it's pretty plain.
It's really light. Too legit. Too legit to quit.
It's good though.
There's some underlying flavor.
There's like a spice.
Yeah, but spice. It's so light that I almost can't taste the flavor, but there is some flavor down there, Timmy, and you can find it. You're like a hound dog for flavor.
It's got some kind of spice going.
You're like a hound dog. You'd be like, it tastes like a fence post. It tastes like a fence post, and like when you get mail on Tuesday and you lick the mail. There's some underlying flavor, but it's so light that I can't taste it. This is like 3.5% max by volume.
Yeah, maybe.
Water. I give this negative 6,152 jerseys.
Wow.
Don't feed me water and tell me it's beer.
I'm with you on that one.
If you were into it, it's pretty good. Cheers.
These guys confuse me sometimes. First, they say they don't like beer with flavor. Then they say this beer isn't flavorful enough. Absolute nerds they are. Personally, I really enjoyed Zach's American Lager and noted a bready malt flavor that balanced the almost absent hop character, though it was there subtly. Very clean, crisp, just how I like it. Great job, Zach.
Yeah, that sounded so good. American Light Lager is my current passion project. I mean, I've talked a bunch of times about my Kolsch recipe, but American Light Lager is the one that I'm currently struggling with, and that is just such a hard beer to make well. And I mean, to make well, it's got to be crystal clear. It's got to be highly carbonated. It's got to be light, but not too light. So I agree with you there, Jersey and Tim. But it also can't be like overwhelmed by hops, right? It can't be too bitter. It's got to be just that perfectly balanced beer. And I love the word balanced there to describe that, because it's just, it's just so light that everything is just so perfectly balanced that nothing stands out.
Yeah.
And that's what I like about American Light Lager. And so that's why it's a passion project for me. I don't have my recipe dialed in yet, but it sounds like this one was on point.
I really liked it. I'm not sure it was intended to be an American light lager or just a standard American lager, but I didn't perceive it as being too light at all. I don't know where the guys were coming from on that, but I thought the beer was great, and I have a feeling that if they weren't, hyper focused on doing such a great review of Zach's American lager, they probably would have enjoyed it, maybe a bit more. But whatever, who cares what they think? I enjoyed it, Zach, and thanks again for sending it in. If you'd like to have your beer or any other fermented beverage you feel like sending in to be reviewed on the show, you can email me, Marshall@brewlosophy.com, and we'll get you all set up. Time for a quick break. When we return, our focus will be on our experiences with beer off flavors. After a long brew day, the last thing I want to do is waste more time chilling wort. I've tried so many different options, and ultimately I settled on the super efficient immersion chillers made by Jaded Brewing. With the King Cobra and Hydra, I'm able to chill my entire batch of wort from boiling to just a few degrees above groundwater temperature in as little as 6 minutes. If an immersion chiller is right for your brewery, then do yourself a favor and check out all of the rad options Jaded Brewing has to offer at jadedbrewing.com, and be sure to let them know Brewlosophy sent you.
Compact and simple to use with a small footprint for brewing indoors, the Grainfather makes it easy for you to brew professional quality beers at home. The Grainfather is an all-in-one brewing system that lets you brew all grain beer in a single compact stainless steel unit. It uses an electric heating element and pump to maintain a constant temperature and to circulate the wort during the mashing and cooling stages. It also comes with a counterflow chiller to reduce chilling times and produce high-quality wort. And now, with the addition of their conical fermenter, the Grainfather takes things one step further by offering homebrewers state-of-the-art temperature-controlled fermentation just like commercial breweries use. And with the Grainfather Recipe Creator and Connect app, you can easily design a recipe, sync your brewing system with your phone, and then just sit back and relax as the app takes over and assures that you maintain your scheduled mash temps and boil schedule. Head to Grainfather.com to purchase your all-in-one brewing system today and to sign up for their free recipe creator tool. Once more, head on over to Grainfather.com, that's Grainfather.com, and get started today.
Family-owned Atlantic Brew Supply is the largest homebrew shop in the Southeast. No gimmicks, no multinational corporate overlords, and no BS. They offer exclusive malts, yeast, and more from local artisans, as well as award-winning recipe kits. They also sell professional brewing gear and cask equipment from sister companies ABS Commercial and Cask Supply. Most ingredients are available by the ounce, plus Atlantic Brew Supply has an on-site calculator to help you craft your best brew. Orders are processed same day, and 2-day shipping is guaranteed for East Coast customers. Get 15% off your first order using promo code BREWPOD, that's BRUPOD, at AtlanticBrewSupply.com. Craftmaster Growlers takes traveling with and sharing beer to a new level. Made from heavy-duty stainless steel, Craftmaster Growlers are double-wall insulated and can keep beer cold for up to 8 hours. Unlike typical growlers, Craftmaster Growlers come with a swiveling tap and fully integrated CO2 regulator cap, allowing beer to stay fresh for 2 weeks or more. The square design takes up less space and will fit in most refrigerator doors, and every Craftmaster Growler comes with a 1-year warranty. There are 64 and 128-ounce versions available over at craftmastergrowlers.com. The experience is ubiquitous. You brewed a beer you think is tasting pretty great. You decide to take it to a homebrew club meeting or a beer share and give it to other beer nerds. Before you're even done pouring all the samples for your friends, one blurts out that they've detected something off. Diacetyl, DMS, acetaldehyde. Whatever it might be, this likely self-proclaimed aficionado digs their teeth in, trying to convince others to validate his or her perception. You know exactly what I'm talking about here. Before we get into our experiences with off flavors, I have a little tip. The next time something like this happens, just politely ask the person when they last sampled a beer intentionally dosed with the actual off flavor they're claiming to perceive. Usually they'll admit they never have, and that their conception of off flavors is based on stuff that they've read online or heard on a podcast just like this one, which is part of the reason we wanted to focus on this subject. Right, kid?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, you and I have had a lot of conversations about this, and we had a lot of conversation even just amongst the brew crew, and then myself in my own homebrew club meetings, how like flavors and off flavors especially are dependent on the individual person too, right? So like when I read the flavor corn, or I'm just going to stick with that one, and we'll go through some other examples later, but corny, to me, I know what corn tastes like, but that doesn't taste like DMS to me. Right. And that's what everybody says, like, oh, cooked corn. That's what DMS is. No, there's a lot of malts out there that have a corny kind of cereal grain flavor to it. And so that's what I started, noticing as corn. And, that's just one example. And we'll talk about some of these examples that we get into here. And that's the point of this episode, is talk about like our experiences with the flavors to kind of put maybe some color or some different terms on each of these off flavors so that you have a little bit more information when you're discussing, how to make your beer better. Because again, that's what this is all about. It's making your beer better and identifying the problem so that you can fix it for the next batch.
Yeah, and there is an issue with thinking that a problem has been identified when one actually isn't there. And then you're chasing a ghost, basically, right? I remember talking with somebody about my perception of DMS. We're going to get into that one a little bit more later because I think it's a big one. But after I did, that was one of the first flavor standards I ever actually tried that I got from Flavor Active, and dosed some really pale lager with it and realized this doesn't taste like what everybody says it's supposed to taste like. And in the conversations I was having with other people, it made me realize like the descriptors that exist there now may not be as spot on as people like to believe they are. But I remember having this conversation with a friend, and what they conceived of me saying was that these off flavors don't exist. No, we're not saying that at all. Off flavors are absolutely real. Yes, we have struggled to produce some of them in our own trials and in our own brewing when we intentionally try to, but they are real. They're measurable. You can actually, put these things into the lab, have them objectively measured in a lab. I mean, nobody's here saying that they're not real. Just that there is a subjective component to perception in general, and that might be different for different people, and the way things get perceived in certain styles of beer might also be different as well. We just want to kind of focus a little bit more on that. Now, sometimes senses do fail us, and they can be influenced by many things. On the physical front, you've got your environment, people who smoke cigarettes, if you're around a specific scent. I remember I was going to House of Pendragon right when they opened, and I was sitting next to this fella who just was loaded up on cologne, and all I smelled in my fruity IPA was floral. And I couldn't help but wonder if it wasn't because the person next to me had so much cologne on. Little things like that can really have a big impact on your perception.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, where you are smelling and tasting these beers can totally have an issue. Like if I just ate some really spicy salsa,
right,
that's got a lot of cilantro and flavors and stuff in it, I might taste floral in my beer, or, taste something that's not there. But that raises another issue too, which we're going to talk about in each of these off flavors, is the flavor threshold.
Right.
Like that's different for different people. Some people are more sensitive to some of the compounds than other ones. Like one that we'll talk about for me is sulfur compounds, like stinky sulfur compounds. I'm just not very sensitive to them. Which is fantastic for me because I can drink an egg fart beer like no trouble. But I mean, for some people that's going to be an issue.
Yeah, no, that's funny. And that kind of leads to this other aspect of senses and perception, and that's the psychological side of it. There is people like to think that they are in full control of all of their capacities, and the truth of the matter is none of us are in full control of that much. You've got things like expectation. If I go to a BJCP judge friend of mine and I say, hey, this beer right here was, fermented. It's a lager that was fermented warm, and it's only been lagering for 2 weeks and not, 2 months. I'm setting him up or her up with an expectation, and there's a good chance that they're going to perceive the off flavors that are associated with those process things, right? That's just the way we work as humans. We tend to find what we're looking for, and that plays a role in the way we perceive things as well. And that's kind of, to me, that's the more fun part of what we're going to be talking about. We've mentioned stuff like this in the past before. We're just going to go a little bit into more detail on it. So again, our plan is to go through a number of of beer off flavors. Obviously, we can't hit on every single one of them, but we've got a pretty hefty list. We're going to talk about how they're created and avoided, some common descriptors associated with each of them, and where they're naturally found, as well as our experiences with actual flavor standards and possible things that they can be mistaken for. The first one, perhaps in my experience at least, one of the more often mentioned off flavors that I hear is diacetyl.
Yeah, diacetyl's a fun one, right? And this one is one I'm very, very sensitive to. So not sensitive to sulfur, but very sensitive to diacetyl. But this butterscotch popcorn flavor, which also there's also a mouthfeel component of it too. So that's the aroma and flavor, but it also creates this like slickness on your tongue or like on your teeth. Like if you were just to like lick some butter and then lick your teeth, it's like an oil coating kind of on the back of your teeth. And so that one, diacetyl is a big one, and it's cited a lot. And that's another one of those that we know is like objectively in beer, but about a quarter of the population doesn't have the gene that allows them to sense diacetyl, which I think is totally fascinating.
A quarter of the population. Put that together. That's 25% of people out there, and that is likely beer drinkers as well, who don't have the ability to, or who have, what I've read at least, is that they're the threshold for them to perceive it, rather than being that 0.04 ppm range, is a little bit higher. So they need to have, it needs to be like maximal amount in the beer for somebody to taste it. My first experience with diacetyl was at a homebrew club meeting, probably 11 years ago or so. The president, Sean Wood at the time, brought he brought just butter flavoring from the store, and I guess that stuff is diacetyl, is made with diacetyl. And then we dosed Coors Light with it. And we're talking like one drop, and that Coors Light tasted like butterscotch. It was disgusting. It left that slick feeling on your tongue. So at the time I'm thinking, I mean, there was no way you couldn't taste this stuff, right? At the time I'm thinking, geez, I've never made a beer that tastes this awful. I'm doing well, you know? Well, come to find out, when I actually got real flavor standards from Flavor Active, and I dosed diacetyl to the threshold, the kind of, set threshold that Flavor Active recommends, I dosed some real simple, clean German lager with it. And lo and behold, I could not reliably distinguish the beer that had the diacetyl in it, which taught me a lot. Meanwhile, almost everybody else could. So, I mean, I'm stuck in this spot trying to be honest with myself, like, holy moly, what if I just don't have the ability to detect these kind of accepted normal flavor threshold levels of diacetyl in beer?
Yeah, exactly. Well, and that's a good point too, right? There's a distinction between flavor threshold, like the ability of humans to perceive a compound, and then what is considered an off flavor in beer, right?
Yeah.
And I think that's a really important thing, especially for diacetyl, because, diacetyl comes from the process, comes from the fermentation process. So it's actually like a component. It's a little intermediary in amino acid production for yeast cells. And so it exists in every single beer that is produced, but to varying different degrees. So again, this is one of those off flavors that is in every beer, and it's probably in every finished beer that you're consuming. It's just at a level that's low enough that it's not an off flavor, or maybe even perceptible to some people. Yeah,
no, exactly. Like you said, it's created naturally during fermentation. And the idea is that during fermentation with pretty much any type of microbe, wild yeast can do it, bacteria can create diacetyl as well. And if you start to notice diacetyl creeping up in a beer, chances are you've got some sort of a contamination. At least that's been my experience. And that will reach those levels where it's hard not to perceive it after a while. But yeah, diacetyl is naturally produced during standard fermentation. And the idea is to ensure that your fermentation is complete, that you're pitching healthy yeast, all of the normal recommendations when it comes to yeast and fermentation. Also, good sanitation, obviously. If diacetyl is going to be created by a contaminant, you want to make sure that you're cleaning and sanitizing everything really well. So the next off flavor that we're going to talk about, probably number 2, if not already number 1 on the list of most commonly cited by brewers, is DMS, dimethyl sulfide.
Yeah, so DMS, dimethyl sulfide, the common descriptors on this one are cooked corn, right? That's the one that I hear all the time. And this one does not taste like cooked corn for me, or at least I guess I don't know what cooked corn tastes like. I've had canned corn. I eat corn. I know what corn tastes like, but this flavor is not that to me. So I hear a lot of other people talk about it too. There's a lot of descriptors for this one as well, like cooked cabbage, tomato paste, and I've even heard some people describe it as like asparagus pea. if you've had asparagus and the next day whenever you're peeing and it's that smell, that like vegetable smell that comes from it.
Yeah.
To me, the tomato paste and the asparagus pea are actually closer than cooked corn. But yeah, this one's a really, really interesting one from a perception standpoint.
Yes, and I'm with you. This was one of the ones where when I used a real flavor standard and I dosed the beers without hesitation, I could distinguish the one that was dosed with DMS. And all those people who were easily able to recognize the diacetyl dosed beer, were the one that I couldn't, struggled on this one, which I thought was just so weird. It was like an opposite experience. It was so obviously ketchupy to me, and that's what I got from it. I got that from the powder, just the powder before I mixed it with the beer. When it hit the beer, it tasted like, the way I've described it is like if you were to take ketchup and leave it out overnight. So it's kind of like a funky, tomatoey, vinegary kind of scent. Now, it is a sulfur compound. I mean, that is what it is. So like asparagus pea makes sense. It doesn't smell like that to me. In my experience drinking a ton of homebrew and judging competitions and doing all that, with the exception of Rolling Rock beer, I cannot say that I've had a beer that has had high levels of what I perceived as being DMS. What I have had are beers that have a very grainy, almost like cooked corn in terms of like popcorn aroma and flavor, but I taste that when I eat malt, out of the bin. That to me is a malt flavor, and so I feel like it's easy for people to get confused with the cooked corn descriptor when malt has some of those characteristics anyways. And I could see why somebody would think, oh, this is a malty beer. I usually drink all these super hoppy IPAs, but this Pilsner has more malt character. I'm going to call it DMS.
Right, exactly. And I'm so glad that you brought up Pilsner, right? Because that's one that I think has a lot of cereal grain flavor. And that's kind of how I describe it and that's, to be honest, that's what I thought I was supposed to look for in DMS until I had tried that flavor standard, and it was the flavor standard ultimately that got me thinking about DMS in a different way from cooked corn. And
me too.
So I this is just sort of an aside, a caveat, but if you ever get the ability to do off-flavor training, I think you should absolutely look at common descriptors, but then take a moment while you're doing the training to see what it tastes like to you. How would you describe it if you were just telling somebody, this is what I taste in this glass?
Yeah.
So not dependent on what other people say you're supposed to taste, but what do I taste in this glass? And that's what sort of brought this one home for me. So this one and acetaldehyde are the two ones that are the most hard and most difficult for me to find in beers. And to me, I think that's also because there's a high concentration of each of those in beer already. So, right. So like, even though our flavor threshold is relatively low on those compounds, they exist in beer. I mean,
right.
Yeah.
The flavor threshold for DMS is 0.025 ppm. ppm is the same as milligrams per liter. That is very, very low. I mean, and so if you can taste it with that amount, it makes sense that you'd want to do certain things to make sure it's not going to be there. Now, DMS again, there's a SMM is the precursor to DMS. It's found in malt, and it volatilizes off during the boil, which is also where it converts to DMS. You boil hard enough, you boil long enough, you're going to volatilize that DMS off. That's what we've all been told. We've been able to brew, beers that are boiled for just 25 minutes, and that DMS volatilizes right off. We're not getting any issues with DMS at least that we're tasting. And apparently, I'm fairly sensitive to it. So, and I do not like it. I'll tell you, that is a nasty flavor. the experiences that I've had.
And this one, I just did an experiment a couple weeks ago, right? Lid on versus lid off,
right.
Which was, an intended to be a DMS type experiment where I was expecting to produce a huge amount of DMS in one batch, and I just didn't get it. It's not. It also comes from yeast. So yeast can produce what's called dimethyl sulfoxide, which then can get reduced to DMS via an enzyme in fermentation. So there's more than one path to getting DMS. But I've got to believe that this one was way more common. Like I said, like about 20 years ago or so with under-modified malts, and that's where I think this one may have been a bigger deal years ago. But to me, I hear a lot of people say that they taste DMS, and very few that I've been able to confirm actually are talking about DMS and not some other just like cereal grain flavor or some other off flavor.
Exactly. And I do recall there was one time, probably, I don't know, must have been about 8 years ago now, somebody from the East Coast sent me a beer that they made. It was like a Vienna Lager or a Munich Dunkel, one of those two. And it had a high percentage of Munich 2, the darker Munich malt in it. And I remember opening that and immediately smelling this sort of ketchup-y vegetable thing, and I thought, oh my God, this is it. This is DMS in a real beer. And the guy sent it out because he was having issues with this beer. He was wondering what was going on with it. Now, I'm not the type who was like, yeah, that's definitely DMS. But I said, hey, based on my experiences with flavor standards, this tastes an awful lot like there could be a DMS issue here. So what do? You do your, again, you got to mind your sanitation, but then you boil a little bit harder. I mean, they recommend boiling with the lid off. We've shown twice now that doesn't seem to make big a difference. But yeah, boil vigorously, boil for a little bit longer, and try to drive that stuff off. So next off flavor that we're going to talk about, you already mentioned it once, Cade, is acetaldehyde, which is not pronounced acetaldehyde. It is acetaldehyde.
Well, I'm glad you cleared that up because I have no idea how to pronounce that one. But yeah, this one is a lot of fun for me too, because this one is probably the most abundant off flavor that is in your beer right now. There's a lot of acetaldehyde that is in your beer right now, and you probably just can't taste it. Because the flavor threshold on this one is pretty high, 5 to 15 parts per million. So remember, DMS was 0.025 parts per million, whereas this one is up at 5 to 15 parts per million. So this is a much, much higher flavors threshold. But the common descriptor on this one is green apple candy, like sucking on a green Jolly Rancher. And this is another one that I just don't agree with. That's not what it tastes like to me. I've had a bunch of green apple Jolly Ranchers, but this one is raw pumpkin, at least around those questionable thresholds. Okay. Right. So if you take a sample of wort that is fermented about 24 hours, that's in the middle of high Kreuzen, and you just taste that, it's going to taste a lot like green apple. All right. And so I do understand the green apple candy descriptor, but sort of towards the end of fermentation, that green apple really goes away. And to me, it starts tasting like or smelling like raw pumpkin. And raw pumpkin is really the flavor that I get whenever you dose it with the flavor standard, and whenever you're talking about those sort of questionable, acetaldehyde contaminations in a finished beer.
Yeah, I'm 100% with you on that one. That is, I remember thinking, man, green apple, you can't miss that. If that's in a beer, it's green apple Jolly Rancher is such a pungent flavor to me. And I remember people telling me, yeah, if you drink a Budweiser or Bud Light, that you're going to taste acetaldehyde. It has that note to it. I'm not a big fan of Bud Light. I'm a Miller Lite guy myself. I like the kind of grainy thing that I get from that. I don't get green apple from Bud Light. Maybe that's just me. I mean, I could lack the sensitivity to acetaldehyde in general. But when I've done a flavor standard with acetaldehyde, I got squash. I mean, it was like a squashy raw pumpkin is what you describe it as. That's how I perceived it. Now, I did wonder, and I do wonder, if perhaps there is like if there's just a little bit of acetaldehyde, then maybe I could see how you might be like a whisper of a green apple thing or kind of a tart Granny Smith flavor. I could see that being the case potentially, but again, the flavor standards that I've had, it is unavoidably squashy. I mean, and it's bad. It's really gross. Apparently, also, acetaldehyde is associated with headaches if you drink too much beer that has too much acetaldehyde, which makes sense. It is a precursor to ethanol, to the alcohol that we are producing to be in the beer.
Yeah, it's literally in the chemical equation. It's literally the precursor, right? Well, I won't go into too much about the fermentation, but fermentation is generally like glucose to pyruvate, and then pyruvate goes to acetaldehyde and then ethanol. So that's how fermentation goes. It's literally the next step between ethanol is acetaldehyde. So it's in every single beer that you have, and there's going to be varying amounts of it. But the one of the other descriptors that I heard people say about this beer, it also describes how you can avoid acetaldehyde, is young. All right, I read this on a couple of brewing sheets for beers that I had submitted to competitions, and then I talked about this with some other brewers, and that's a really frustrating descriptor to get on your judging sheet. Young, okay, because young doesn't tell me shit about the beer, except maybe I should have let it sit a little longer, but it doesn't tell me what the actual off flavor is, right? Is it just not hoppy enough? Is it too hoppy? Young doesn't tell you anything, but that's one of the ways that you can get rid of acetaldehyde. Remember, acetaldehyde's the precursor to ethanol.
Yeah.
So that just means it hasn't yet converted to ethanol. So what do? Wait.
You wait.
And then it convert
exactly
to ethanol.
Yeah. And that's one of the things I feel like needs to be focused on as well. And there are other off flavors where if it's there are things you can do to get rid of it. And that's the nice thing about acetaldehyde. Now, if you've taken your beer, maybe it's young. I do think that's a weird thing to write on a like a competition judging forum as well. But if it's too young or whatever, and you remove most of that yeast, you might have to wait a bit longer because it's the yeast doing its thing, right? That is what's going to take away that acetaldehyde. It's going to reconvert it into ethanol. Now, something that I learned that I had no idea about this until I was doing some research for this show is that you can create, or acetaldehyde can be created by cold side oxygen exposure. So we talk so often about cold side oxidation. Never have I considered the fact that acetaldehyde is an issue that can be in those beers. It can reconvert ethanol back into acetaldehyde because of that exposure to oxygen. Fascinating to me.
Yeah. That was something that I just learned a couple of weeks ago too in a biochemistry class that I'm taking here. That's a fascinating one too. So yeah, avoid oxygen and wait to let your beer wait to let your beer finish out. That ethanol to acetaldehyde reaction it goes both ways. It's a reversible reaction.
Yeah, that's fascinating.
Yeah, which is amazing. And just a caveat before we go to the next one, I think Miller Lite and Bud Light do smell subtly like acetaldehyde to me. So that's it's like that little bit. It's just a little bit of that raw pumpkin, raw squashy smell, and that's how. I can definitely smell it whenever I taste those two beers, and I like it. I like that little subtlety.
You like pumpkin beers, apparently, huh?
Apparently so. I do actually like pumpkin beers, much to, I think, every brewlosopher's chagrin. I do love pumpkin beers.
You like pumpkin spice beers is what you like.
Okay, fair enough. That's true.
True. You know what? There's reasons that a lot of us don't like that, and we're going to hit on those off flavors later. But yes, how do you make sure to do what are the things you can do to best avoid producing acetaldehyde or having a beer that results with acetaldehyde in it? Again, pitch healthy yeast, pitch a proper pitch rate, ramp the temperature towards the end of fermentation to encourage that yeast activity, right? To complete its metabolization. And then again, you mentioned it earlier, you can leave that beer on the yeast a couple days after fermentation finishes or until you just no longer detect acetaldehyde in the beer. Those are probably the best tips that I've got for that.
Yeah, that last one is my favorite one. Is just wait and let it sit on the yeast for a couple of days after you stop seeing airlock activity. That's generally plenty of time for the yeast or for that acetaldehyde to finish converting over to ethanol.
Yeah, and on that point, I remember, in the earlier days of brewlosophy, we were turning these experiment beers around in 2 weeks or less. I mean, 10 to 14 days usually. And I was getting emails from people saying, wait a minute, my homebrew shop told me, leave it on the yeast for 2 weeks and then rack it to a secondary and leave it there for 2 weeks. And then you can package it and drink it. That your guys are cutting that in half, basically. You're not doing the secondary thing. Fermentation, if you're pitching healthy yeast at proper rates, fermentation's pretty quick. Once it gets going, you're looking 3 to 4 days for most, moderate OG beers for the actual fermentation piece to be done. And then if you leave it for a few more days, that cleanup that people refer to, and I like that word, the yeast doing its cleanup work is going to occur in those couple 2 or 3 days. And you can, I'm a big proponent. Taste your beer. Try to avoid oxygen exposure, but taste your beer. See if you notice anything in it. And if you do, leave it there for a little bit longer. There's nothing wrong with that. So Next off flavor is, and this is a weird one, it's metallic, which, is typically going to be ferrous sulfate, kind of the irony flavor. But to me, metallic, when I think of that, or the beers that I've had that have a notably metallic note, it's kind of like when you were a kid, I mean, I don't know how many kids did this other than me, but you put like a penny in your mouth and it just has that metally kind of flavor. That can be in beer as well.
It's funny that you mentioned as a kid, because I did a number of dumb and stupid things as a kid, but one of the things I did was lick a battery, a 9-volt battery. And to me, that's still what resonates for me with metallic. Now that might just be a stupid Cadeism, but it kind of has that same like shocking sensation metallic does.
Yeah.
It is like licking a penny. There's this very like sharpness to it that there's almost a mouthfeel component as well. But yeah, I mean, I've also heard it as like bloody. That if you like bite your lip or something, you've got blood in your mouth. That's metallic tasting to me, and that's what I think of whenever I think of the metallic off flavor.
Yeah, the blood thing, it sounds gross because it's blood, but that is probably, in my experience, and I've had metallic off flavor standards as well, that experience of that taste of that blood where it's kind of sharp on your tongue and just has that metal, iron-like flavor, that is what metallic beer tastes like to me. And there have been a few commercial examples that I've had, surprisingly, that are so metallic. Where does that come from? The most common, this is what's written out there. I'm not sure how else you would get this, but the most common way, or the most common, source of this that's discussed online is metal that has somehow, like, let's say a fermentation tank that's a stainless fermentation tank that somehow developed a rust spot or has a scratch in it, something like that, or some other, part of your gear that is not passivated is one, is an issue that I've heard. If you don't properly passivate your stainless before using it, you can get a metallic off flavor. I'm not sure if there are any other ways to produce this metallic character besides that, except for, and this is one I kind of put a caveat on it, a little asterisk, because I'm not sure how accurate I am in this, but I have made beers where I just way overdo the mineral profile. So I might do something like a 500 or 600 ppm of sulfate, and I'm adding this heaps of gypsum. And in those beers, I get a sensation on my palate that is very metallic-y. It's like that cold, sharp, bloody flavor. And I wonder sometimes if perhaps the mineral level of the water, of our brewing water, might contribute to that metallic experience as well.
Yeah, and I'm glad you brought that up, because that's one of the ones that I was going to talk about a little bit too, is that water chemistry can sometimes result in phenolics that can taste or smell metallic, and that's exactly one of those things, right? Like if you add, or if you brew with like hard water, like well water or tap water that has a bunch of residual metals and stuff in it, by adding things to it, you can cause like reactions with those metals that cause that metallic flavor. Now, I've also heard like brass and nickel plated like faucets, so like beer faucets, can cause metallic off flavors. But honestly, I was kind of surprised that you had said that you had tasted this one. I don't think I've ever encountered a metallic off flavor in the wild, meaning like I have had off flavor metallic taste standards, but I've never actually had a bottle of beer or a can or a glass or anything that's actually tasted metallic. And one of the reasons I mentioned can there is I hear so many people say like, "Oh God, this beer tastes metallic," and I'm like, "Well, you just drank it out of a can. You just hit your teeth on the can." Okay, like I understand, maybe you didn't get like metal coming off of the can, but that sensation of hitting your teeth to the metal is a sensation that you get, that I get at least, from a metallic off flavor.
Yeah, I've only ever had it perceptibly, personally, in commercial examples that are in bottles, and I don't know what causes it or what did cause it. One of them, probably 5 or 6 years ago, I went and bought a 6-pack of Scrimshaw Pilsner, which is a North Coast brewing company, delicious Pilsner when you get it on tap. And this particular 6-pack, every bottle had this noticeably metallic thing going on in it. And, I don't get it anymore. I still drink that beer. I love that beer. But for some reason, this one batch I perceived as having this metallic thing. It was really odd. I wondered if maybe there was like some rust on the caps they were using or something, like something had to contribute that characteristic. But it's an interesting one. Flavor threshold for metallic is 1 to 1.5 ppm of ferrous sulfate in the beer. And that's pretty high. You have to get a lot of it in there to taste it, I guess. But yeah, very interesting. Or actually, I guess 1 to 1.5 is relatively low. You're going to taste it if it's there, right?
Yeah, you're gonna taste it if it's there, and that's a good point that you mentioned, like rust, because I've seen some like oxidation, like rust characteristics in the bottle before. That's another good like flavor, descriptor for this compound, and maybe that is how some of it got in the bottle. Who knows?
Yeah. Exactly. Who knows? To make sure that you don't get metallic off flavors, don't make beer with pennies. Ensure that all of your metal gear is in good shape, and treat your brewing water properly. That to me is just a precautionary one because I'm not entirely convinced it'll contribute a metallic flavor, but it will contribute a minerally flavor, and that might be perceived as metallic. So, all right, this next one is one that I'm very, very interested in, and I've got some fun stories about it. It's 3-methyl-2-butene-1-thiol, also known as light struck, also described as skunk.
Oh yeah, the skunk bombs. So I've got two fun stories about this one that I'll share in a minute. But let's talk about the descriptors. Yeah, so skunky is in my mind exactly.
It smells exactly like skunk. I mean, there's and for those out there who partake in the cannabis side of the life, that skunk can also smell like certain strains of weed, and there is a very distinct kind of weedy skunk dankness in beers that have been light struck.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, this like weed dank flavor, skunk stink. I've actually got an episode of the Brew Lab that's going to come out in about it's about a month or so out. But it's with Keith Villa, and he runs a low alcohol cannabis infused brewery outside of Denver, Colorado. And one of the things that they did a study on reducing this light struck compound. So it's a thiol, which means it's got an SH group on the end. Mm-hmm. That's what causes that like sort of nasty, or that's what it results in that skunky weed dank smell. And so thiols exist, in hops and in weed. And so he was trying to treat and prevent his beers from, being light struck, adding copper to it to reduce this compound. Right. But then I asked him, and we get into it really a little bit in the show. It's like, well, wait, doesn't that like reduce some of the weed character and dank flavor? And turns out it does. So yeah, that's going to be a fun one. So check out that episode. It's a good one.
Oh yeah. So how is this light struck character created? To me, it's one of the more interesting ones, and I'm telling you, you've had it, and you can create it very quickly. It is a chemical reaction between riboflavin in beer, the alpha acids from hops, and ultraviolet light. And people will say that even natural or like artificial light in a house can create this. I've not experienced that. If you're sitting inside a building and they have lights on, I've not had light struck beer because of that. If you want to taste what a light struck beer tastes like, take some beer, whatever it is. I don't care if it's an IPA, if it's a stout, if it's whatever, and put it in a clear glass and put it in direct sunlight for 10 seconds. Just trust me on this one. We did a really fun little experiment. It's about 5 friends over a few years ago, and I had a Bohemian Pilsner, a Czech Pilsner on tap. And what we did is we took 5 glasses and they were all filled to the same exact level. One stayed in my garage completely out of the sun. And then what we did is we put all 5 outside, and every 10 seconds we pulled one of the other 4 inside, right? To see how quickly it happened, and then what happened the longer it stayed out there. So mind you, the glass that was out there the longest was only out there for about 45 seconds total. The 10-second beer, the one that we pulled first, was absolutely skunked. I mean, and it was sitting in the sun for 10 seconds. This stuff is crazy.
Yeah, it's absolutely nuts how fast that reaction occurs. Like you said, 45 seconds. I mean, in the study with Keith Villa, it was 10 minutes. You created a skunk bomb, just setting your beer outside. So Corona that comes in the clear bottles, Heineken which comes in green bottles. I mean, right. Those beers are sort of notorious for their skunk character. But that's how that exactly happens, exposing your beer to light. Yeah. Now, my funny stories about this. You may have heard me say this a couple times on the podcast before, but when I was doing my beer judge certification, one of the beers in that test, they serve you a beer and they ask you to rate the beer, and then your rating is compared against judges, and that's how they decide if you are, can be certified as a judge or not. It's your judging prowess. And so one of the beers was, it was served to me. It says International Light Lager, and it's served to me, and I'd take a little sniff. I smelled a little bit of sulfur, but nothing bad. And I'm just pounding it. I'm like, damn, this tastes exactly like a Heineken. 42 or something, I scored it. But it turns out it wasn't. It was just a Kolsch from a local brewery that they had sat outside on someone's back porch in Texas for 2 weeks.
Oh my God.
Yeah. So apparently it was a skunk explosion. Not just slightly sulfurous, which is what I got, but a skunk explosion. So this one is really hard for me to get just because those sulfur compounds, for whatever reason, I don't get them. Same thing happened on the Cicerone exam. So the Cicerone exam, they give you a selection of beers and they tell you have to decide if it has an off flavor, and if so, what it is. So it could have an off flavor, it could be spiked, or it could not be spiked. And one of the beers that I got to, I start sniffing this and I'm going, okay, yeah, this smells slightly skunky. So knowing what I know about my sensitivity, I go, okay, yep, it's light struck, it's skunky, here's what you do to fix it. Nope, turns out it was a Continental Pilsner that was actually one of my favorite. It's St. Arnold's, I think it's called Summer Pils, which is a fantastic example. It's a Houston brewery, big regional brewery, and a fantastic Pils. But that Continental Pilsner malt has some of that sulfur skunky character in it to me. And so this is another one. I like this off flavor a lot. This was a fun one because on one hand, it should punch me in the face when it doesn't. And then whenever I think I'm experiencing it, sometimes I confuse it with Continental malt.
I've done the same thing, dude. And to be honest with you, I kind of I like Heineken. I mean, I like Beck's too, and it has just a subtle hint of a skunky thing going on. I don't like overly skunked beer, don't get me wrong, but it's interesting, traveling Europe, Heineken is big over there as well. And you drink a Heineken out of a can. I was walking around Paris and I saw that there was this place that we were stopping for lunch. This was over a decade ago. And we went into this place and they had cans of Heineken. I thought, yeah, I'll get one of those with my lunch. It tasted nothing at all like the Heineken we have over here in the States. And I heard a rumor that Heineken is very well aware of that and intentionally wants their beer to have a little bit more of a sharper, light-struck thing going on for what gets shipped to the States, because that's what we expect over here. And I just think that's fascinating. Listen to this. The flavor threshold for light-struck, 3-methyl, 2-butene, 1-thiol, is 0.000004 ppm. That's 5 zeros, 4 nanograms per liter, and you can perceive it in beer. Not much at all, and it makes that whole thing, that experience of 10 seconds in the sun and noticing it, make a lot more sense. Seriously, I urge everybody to give that a shot. It's a lot of fun to try that one out. How do you avoid light-struck off flavors in beer? Keep your beer out of UV light, out of natural light. If you're fermenting in clear fermentation vessels, keep it in a dark place. Don't bottle in clear bottles or green bottles if you're going to have them in the sun. And just mind, where that sun is at while you're drinking. What drives me crazy is when I go to a brewery and somebody's sitting at a table right in direct sunlight sipping on their beer. I'm thinking, oh my God, that's got to taste awful.
Yeah, not only is your beer getting warm, but it's also getting skunky. One other way to avoid this, check out that episode of the Brew Lab where we'll talk about how you can use copper, different forms of copper in your beer that can prohibit light struck character from forming in your beer if you add copper preemptively.
Yeah, very interesting. All right, next off flavor, hydrogen sulfide. We've talked about it a little bit up front, that this is the kind of rotten egg farty hot spring characteristic in beer, and it can be produced a few different ways. This one is, the flavor threshold for this is 0.004 ppm or 4 micrograms per liter. So, it's pretty low levels. You can perceive it in beer.
Yeah, and sulfur gas and rotten egg are exactly, it is literally sulfur gas,
that's
right?
What
like
it is,
H2S. Yeah, but if you smelled those, a lot of people have smelled that. And so like rotten egg, and those are very, 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 very common. It happens. This stuff happens in fermentation, right? Especially when yeast is stressed. It'll take in like sulfate ions into the cell and then releases that H2S out. Right. So it's actually a gas byproduct. And this was one of the those things that, if you're brewing sour beers or if you're brewing under pressure or if you're not adequately pitching your yeast, you can produce a lot of sulfur gas. And if it's in a closed fermentation vessel, that sulfur can settle back into solution and get like trapped inside your beer.
Yeah. If you treat your water with Campton tablets, that is potassium metabisulfate or sodium metabisulfate, if you overdo or if you're doing high amounts of sulfate from gypsum in your beer, there is a good chance that you are going to experience or have experienced that smell of rotten eggs coming out of your fermentation vessel, your fermentation chamber. It's a natural part of fermentation. If you are fermenting lagers at traditional lager temperatures around 10C or 50F, you probably are going to smell it because that is a naturally somewhat stressful environment for yeast to ferment in, even if you're pitching adequate, amounts of yeast. It's just a natural part of fermentation. So where does this come from in beer? Usually it's because that beer got packaged before it had enough time to off-gas the hydrogen sulfide. But not to worry, it's fairly easy to get rid of. If you are packaging in kegs, especially, and you do a very low oxygen or no oxygen transfer, so you're racking into a purged keg, so you're not going to get cold side oxidation. If you just jostle that keg a little bit, jostle up that beer, and then pull your PRV and release that gas, and you do that 2 or 3 times over the course of a day or two, usually you can get rid of that sulfur character in beer. At least that's been my experience, because it fairly readily off-gases from beer. At least, again, that's been my experience.
Yeah, exactly. It's a little bit more problematic in a commercial brewery standpoint,
Right.
but yeah, I mean, for homebrew kegs, if you can just jostle those and get them off, but an easy fix in the commercial standpoint is to add copper. So again, that copper is going to bind with those sulfates and pull those pull the sulfur compounds out of solution. And so that's another one that's really easy to me. This one, I have smelled sulfur beers in the wild, and this one I'm probably also not very sensitive to, given the other sulfur stuff that I'm not sensitive to. But this is a pretty common sniff test for brewers to see if your beer's done or not. If you just sniff the beer and it smells like sulfur, let it sit for a little longer.
Exactly. And again, this isn't one that I worry too much about. There are certain styles, certain pale lager styles where just a hint of sulfur character actually helps to pronounce the other desirable characteristics of the beer. So it's not necessarily considered an off flavor in that capacity. But too much of it really does. I think it's off-putting. I mean, it smells like, it smells like an egg fart. You don't want that in your beer. So,
right.
Well, we've got to take a quick break. When we return, we're going to be going over another set of commonly discussed off flavors in beer. There's no denying that stainless steel is the best material for brewing equipment, and Delta Brewing Systems offers some of the lowest prices on high-quality stainless gear, like the Firm Tank, which in addition to holding 8 gallons or 30 liters of wort, comes with a domed lid to even further reduce the chances of a messy blow-off. Plus, it can hold up to 4 psi of pressure for closed transfers. Delta Brewing Systems also has their own line of brew kettles, as well as one of the lowest-priced all-in-one electric brewing systems out there, and their prices are shockingly low. If you're in the market for legit stainless gear that won't break the bank, do yourself a favor and head over to deltabrewingsystems.com today. The brew in a bag method has blown up over the last few years, and in that time, it's become very clear that not all bags are created equal. For the best BIAB experience, you have got to go with the Brew Bag. Made from high-quality, food-safe polyester, the Brew Bag is available in both 210 micron for standard brew in a bag, as well as 400 micron, which works beautifully for all-in-one recirculating systems. I've been a Brew Bag user for years and wouldn't brew without it. Head over to brewinabag.com to get the fabric filter that works for you, and use promo code TBP17 at checkout to receive a discount. Again, that's brewinabag.com. Have you ever thought about adding a port to your kettle but held off because you didn't feel like drilling into your gear or sending it off to have someone else do it? From the makers of the world's fastest counterflow chiller, the exGEERience, comes the Hangover, the easiest way to add extra ports to your kettle, as well as countless other options. Mount a faucet to your keg for easy portable pouring. Set up the perfect whirlpool arm. Hold a heating element in place. All of this and so much more without permanently modifying your gear. Manufactured right here in the United States, the Hangover offers brewers too many convenient solutions to list here. So head over to exGEERience.com today to see what the Hangover can do for you. As every brewer knows, the best beer requires the best hops, which Yakima Valley Hops provides fresh from the source to brewers around the world, carrying everything from classics like Cascade to modern favorites like Galaxy and Mosaic, as well as other ingredients and gear. Yakima Valley Hops has it all. And don't forget to check out their new podcast, The Late Edition, where the YVH crew goes into depth on our favorite plant with industry experts. Head over to YakimaValleyHops.com now to see all they have to offer and subscribe to The Late Edition wherever it is you listen to podcasts. Over the last 3 or 4 years, I've adopted a number of practices to reduce what I've come to accept as being one of the absolute worst beer off flavors, and that is oxidation.
All right, yeah, oxidation. I mean, so I want to throw a quick caveat about oxidation. There are 2 descriptors that we're going to talk about in this subject or in this segment that I'm growing to hate because they while they are very good descriptors of what's happening, they're not good descriptors of how to fix it. And so this one is really a good example. Okay, so oxidation and common descriptors of oxidation literally means like getting air in your beer.
Yeah.
Okay, so like
Yeah.
you're getting oxygen into your beer, but the chemical reactions that happen, there's a whole bunch of them, and some of them are actually really good, some of them are really bad, and so this is where it becomes really important for me to talk about the descriptors of oxidation, because those descriptors will then lead you to a different path. For example, all of the following are common descriptors of oxidation: honey, cardboard, wet paper, less fruity, loss of bitterness. Those are all descriptors of oxidation, right? And all of those things are different flavor paths.
So you're right, and in my experience, what I taste is oxidation, and what you know it's happening. If you're aging beer, there's no way to 100% completely reduce oxygen exposure. There's going to be some sort of an impact that oxygen exposure is going to have on that beer, and the longer you let it sit, the more that impact can come out. So you think about things like a big barley wine. And the best big barley wines I've ever had are those that have been aged for a few years. I had a 2014 Firestone Walker anniversary ale just yesterday that somebody brought to my place that was absolutely delicious. And a part of that is because of the age. And that age, the part of the aging process is oxidation. However, you take a New England IPA and you barely expose that to oxygen, and the characteristic is no longer that sweet sherry raisiny thing. It is now like hard candy that had the flavor stripped off of it. It's just this sickly sweet grossness. So to boil it down, to narrow the descriptor that we use to just wet paper or cardboard, which is the absolute most common thing that I've heard oxidation character is described as, I feel like really limits the understanding of what oxidation really is.
Yeah, exactly. And that wet paper cardboard, that's trans-2-nonenal. All right. So that's a specific compound that is an oxidative compound, right? It's a result of oxidation. It actually is out there. And cardboard and wet paper are really good descriptors of it. But like you said, that honey and sweetness, that character has nothing to do with trans-2-nonenal.
Right.
Okay. And I think that's what's also interesting. So like both of those things talk about, they're related, but they're different problems. They're different issues. And like you said, that New England IPA I remember the batch that I did with sodium metabisulfite versus none in like non-oxygen protective packaging. So like literally just open kegs with the beer. Actually, I think I did dump the beer, like literally like poured it from the fermenter into the keg on that. But that with the New England IPA that didn't have SMB in it, that was just dumped beer, turned purple within a week.
Yeah.
And I mean, really purple. You can see the pictures from the experiment on the website. So oxidation is a big deal.
Yeah.
Oxygen reacts with a bunch of compounds. It's a very, very, very reactive, metal. I mean, or a gas. It's a very, very reactive gas. If you think about like a flame reaction, that's oxygen burning. Anytime there's a flame reaction, but it reacts with a whole bunch of things: hop compounds, fatty acids from malt. Yeast can react with oxygen. Yeast byproducts can degrade in the presence of oxygen. There are so many many things, but it all does come back to that one, how did oxygen get into your beer and when, I think is sort of the question.
Exactly. And I think about those beers, like I mentioned before, a big Russian Imperial Stout, a good barley wine, even a nice Belgian triple I've had aged, absolutely delicious with some age on it. The thing is, there's no situation that I can think of where I would like intentionally oxidize my beer. Rather, I would rely on aging for those bigger beers to let that happen, because we know other stuff is happening when you age a beer as well. And then when it comes to pretty much anything other than a big high OG style, I want to do everything I can to limit oxygen exposure. And so that, I've adopted these processes. We talked a little bit about it from this week's feedback, but cold crashing under pressure so as not to suck in any ambient air, which obviously has plenty of oxygen in it. Pressure transferring beer from the fermenter into the keg so as to keep oxygen exposure low, and then also making sure that you purge those kegs of O2 with CO2 before racking into them. Those are the things that I've adopted, the practices that I've adopted to avoid as much oxygen exposure as possible. I absolutely hate oxidized beer. It's disgusting to me.
Yeah, I mean, I think you can taste oxidized beer in a lot of places out in the wild too. I mean, there are a lot of breweries out there that don't do a good job of packaging. Their cans or bottles or whatever. And what matters is the amount of oxygen that really gets into solution. So, like in packaging, if you've got a leaky line, or if you're just dumping into an unpurged package, you've got a lot of oxygen in there that's really going to reduce the shelf life of your beer. So, for the purposes of this, avoiding that oxygen will make your beer shelf stable for longer. You won't see that honey character, the sweet character, as quickly. You will see it over time because oxygen exists in solution and it will cause oxidation compounds. You just can't avoid it. It's about getting it to a level where it's going to last as long as you want it to, or be as shelf stable as you need it to be.
Yeah. And just a quick tip on this one. If you open an IPA and it has a purplish, grayish, brownish tint to it, you are drinking an oxidized beer. Whether you tell yourself you love it or not, there is nothing outside of fruit, fruit additions in a normal recipe IPA beer that's going to make it that color, other than oxygen. At least that's my experience. So if you're opening a beer and you're sharing a picture of it on Facebook and it's brown, chances are that is what an oxidized New England IPA or IPA tastes like. I've actually made a West Coast IPA one time. I don't know where the issue lied, but I brewed it with Jersey, in fact, and it was a single hop, I think it was like a CTZ single hop or a Chinook single hop pale ale that we made. And within about 2 weeks of kegging it, this thing it looked purple. I mean, it went from that nice pale yellow color to this dark purple color. It was so odd. And, where's that coming from? Well, come to find out, it's an oxidative process. Now, what is that exactly being oxidized there is up for debate, but still, if you're pouring beers out and they look like that, just you might want to check who you're buying those beers from. So.
Yeah, exactly. And one other thing I would say about oxygen too, my frustration is, I guess, when people call it like oxidation. So they'll be like, this beer's oxidized. It's the same thing whenever somebody goes, you got acetaldehyde infection. Oh, you got DMS.
Yeah.
Exactly. like that's one of those things that I guess is what frustrates me, and especially with oxidation, because there's so many downstream issues, right? Like, what do you actually taste?
Right.
That'll tell me more about what the problem is than that, it's oxidized. Yeah. So if you are going to use this flavor in describing someone's beer, I would really encourage you, are you tasting honey? Does it look purple? Is there just not as much bitterness as you were expecting? More sweet from the malt or something, any of those things. But anyway, I'll let that sit there, and maybe we'll talk about this on a Brews Views at some future point.
Well, and one final note, this is again my personal perception part of it, is that in hoppier styles, particularly those that are seeking some bitterness, so like a West Coast IPA, oxidation, there's this idea that it like mutes the bitterness. It definitely will mute that hop character. To me, it kind of transforms the hop character into being more candy-like as opposed to fresh fruity or fresh hoppy even. But if a beer that has hops that are oxidized in it, or maybe hasn't been exposed to too much oxygen, can also amplify what I've been told is a beta acid bitterness, which is very sharp and unpleasant. Not good at all, in my opinion. So another thing just to watch out for. You can also get a high hyper bitter beer just by over hopping, too early in the kettle. So that's a thing as well. So next off flavor that we're going to talk about is astringency, which oddly enough isn't really a flavor. It's more of a sensation on your palate.
Yeah, and I love that you described it as a flavor or as a sensation, not a flavor, because I feel like the flavor is what gets thrown around a lot, right? They call it a puckering or like sucking on a tea bag or like actually like, tasting a tea bag that's had the tea, brewed out of it already. The flavor of the tea is not really appropriate to me. That like when somebody says like it's a tea, it's like that. I think of tea and I think, okay, tea's got a little bit of a bittering or a puckering sensation. Okay, I can kind of understand. But the sensation to me is what's important. It's that physical reaction. It's that ow. Like, whoa, what was that? That kind of thing. Maybe not as bad as licking a battery, but something, something kind of similar. And there are varying degrees of astringency. Okay. Okay. Like if you're drinking a red wine, that red wine is going to have tannins in it, right, which means it's going to be astringent, right? And that may be totally appropriate and taste absolutely fantastic. But the off flavor comes when you have that puckering sensation.
Yeah. And I feel like this is one of the more difficult ones because everybody has experienced astringency. Not everybody hates it. And so it's or even notices it or care. But there are various things out there that naturally have some sort of an astringent characteristic to it. Red wine is a perfect one. When I like red wine, and when I drink it, once I swallow the wine, there's this kind of fuzzy feeling on the side of my mouth. I get a little bite in the back of my jowls. That is tannic astringency, and we know that. I have a friend who likes to brew with wood, and his beers are excellent. But you get a little bit of that same experience, that kind of tannin twinge in the back of your jowls. That to me, you expect in a beer like that, right? A beer that's made with wood. Now, when we use the term off flavor, again, this is a sensation more than it is a flavor. We're talking about when that's inappropriate, when that experience is inappropriate. And I feel like that's a big thing. Just because somebody made an oak aged saison or whatever it might be, and you get a little bit of that, well, you expect it there. So that's not really an off flavor. It doesn't need to be pointed out. If it's too much, if it's in a pale ale, if it's in, a Pilsner or something, then it's, you can point it out. You can say that this is an unpleasant sensation when I'm drinking this beer. Common ways that astringency is said to get into beer. I think the most common one is over sparging. If you're a fly sparge brewer and you sparge below, I think they say something like 1 degree Plato, which is about 1004 specific gravity points. So if your runoff gets below that 1004, I guess, magic point, I guess you can kind of extract tannins from the grain husks. I've never been an exclusive fly sparge brewer, and I've never brewed a beer that I've noticed without using wood, that I've noticed a legit like astringent off flavor in.
Yeah, and this one, again, I was a fly sparge brewer, and I never actually, I never got my runnings down to that level, okay? So I don't have a personal experience where I've over sparged my wort, and it has led to astringency. But again, the key thing I'm going to keep focusing on here is what you and I have been discussing. It says, when is astringency a problem? At what point does it get to be too much? Yes, scientifically, you can extract tannins from over-sparging your grains. Tannins lead to astringency. But is that actually going to result in a big enough change in the final beer that you're actually going to have this mouth puckering sensation? And I'll give you an example. All right, so polyphenols are astringent compounds, okay? Polyphenols come from hops. Cascade, for example, which has grapefruit citrus character, has a lot of polyphenols in it. And Cascade, that grapefruit character, has a little bit of a bitterness to it. Mm-hmm. A high bitterness, you might say, on occasion, right? So that high bitterness, a lot of people will taste that and go, this is too high bitterness. It's astringent. Uh-huh. Those are different things. Again, astringency is that puckering mouthfeel, and that may be a result of bitterness, but it might not. It might also be a result of some of these other things. The common list, like you said, over sparging. Not monitoring the mash pH or your sparge water pH. That if you don't acidify your sparge water, you're going to pull astringency out of these grains. My best guess, based on all of the people that I've talked to and my own experience, not acidifying sparge water. is these just aren't going to lead to astringency in your beer, especially as a home brewer. There may be some considerations at the commercial level if you're over extracting, from grains, because there you can actually, contribute a large amount of tannins to your beer. But again, I think astringency for me is one of those that I don't really concern myself with. And if I taste it in a beer, I'm probably going to second guess that I'm actually tasting astringency. I'm probably going to define it as something else.
Yeah, I hear a lot of people describe astringency as bitterness. They are different. I mean, they are perceptibly different. Astringency, I hate when people, just take a tea bag and put it on your cheek. I mean, you're going to get astringency, but that is a very extreme form of it. It's not what you're going to perceive in a beer that's astringent, in my experience at least. As a brew in a bag brewer, some of the weird things that people have said about that. Oh, don't squeeze the bag. You're going to squeeze tannins out of the grains. Come on, that's BS. Another one is if you mill the grain too fine, which is a brew in a bag brewer we tend to do, right? That somehow that you're like somehow like obliterating that grain husk and you're going to leach tannins out. Never have I ever experienced that, and I mill as fine as I possibly can. The one area where I have definitely perceived that astringent puckering and fuzziness in my mouth is beers that have been contaminated. And there is some evidence that those contamination with certain wild yeasts or bacteria, other microbes, can contribute an astringency that is very unbecoming of the beer. It's very, very hard to drink those beers. It's part of what makes contaminated beer so icky, in my opinion.
Yeah, no, that's a good one. The other thing I would also say is like minerality in your water chemistry can sometimes come across as astringent.
Yeah.
And so that might be another place. If you are getting a mouth puckering sensation, you might want to take a look at what your water chemistry is. That might also be contributing to that flavor sensation, or that flavor sensation, that mouthfeel sensation.
Right. So there are a couple off flavors that are perfectly appropriate in certain styles, but completely inappropriate in other styles. We're going to talk about some of those now. One of them is isoamyl acetate, also known as banana flavor. Obviously, if you're a big fan of Bavarian Hefeweizen or wit beer, there is an absolute expectation that you have isoamyl acetate in those styles of beer, which contribute that to me, it tastes like banana runts. I'm not a big fan of it. I don't like artificial banana in general. I always gave away my banana now and laters to my sister when I was a kid. But that is the flavor that comes from isoamyl acetate. The flavor threshold for that is just 1.4 ppm, so it's very easy to taste. You can't miss it if it's in a beer.
Yeah, and it's totally appropriate, like you said, in that Weissbier, Hefeweizen style. I mean, it defines the style, that and clove, which we'll get to in a minute. But yeah, banana is. I mean, it's an ester. It's produced during yeast fermentation, and it's absolutely appropriate in that style Weissbier Hefeweizen, but not necessarily in a light lager, right?
Exactly.
An American light lager. If I taste some banana in there, I'm gonna go, whoa, what was that? That's kind of weird.
Yeah.
But it's interesting too when you get sort of into the science about isoamyl acetate and like what it does. It's just an ester, which is an ester is an alcohol and an acid, so they're around in beer to different levels, but they are produced like differently and based on the yeast strain that you're using, right? So yeast strains don't all produce huge amounts of isoamyl acetate, but some do. And then you get into sort of all this kind of like mucky area about oxygen and what oxygen does. So we always talk about oxygenating your high gravity beers because it'll offshoot this isoamyl acetate, this banana flavor in your like really big beers. And you don't necessarily want that in your big beers most of the time. Yeah. So one of the things people say to do is oxygenate your beer. But on the Brew Lab, we did that episode with Dr. Luis Castro, and what they found was at 8 ppm, which is the standard level that you're supposed to oxygenate at to avoid isoamyl acetate, isoamyl acetate was at its highest level.
Go figure.
So you kind of get in the science of this. This was kind of fascinating. That it's kind of all over the place in like what causes it and what how you can avoid it. But again, that banana and fruity flavor, especially in Hefeweizen, is absolutely something that I want in that beer style.
Yeah, and there, and a descriptor that I read recently, or that I heard about for isoamyl acetate that I've never perceived it as, or I've never, I guess, conceived of it as, is sweet hair. There have been times where I've used Imperial Yeast Dieter. That is their Kolsch strain to ferment really simple Kolsch style beers. And I do get this slight perry ester from it that I'm realizing maybe is just a low level isoamyl acetate, presence in that beer. And it's not bad. It's not something that I absolutely love, but one of the things that you will commonly hear isoamyl acetate as being caused by is warmer fermentation temperatures. And I say that because probably years ago on the online forums, you'd constantly see people, a lot of new brewers wanted to make Bavarian Hefeweizen Weiss beer because it tastes good. It's fun. It's kind of, you're copying like a Blue Moon or whatever. That's a wit beer, but they wanted to make that. And you'd see them hit the forums and asking, well, how do I produce more banana character and less clove character? And one of the recommendations was, if you want more banana, you got to ferment it warmer, up around 70 to 72 degrees Fahrenheit, which is about, like 20-ish degrees C. So interesting to me that you can kind of coax out more of the banana character with warmer fermentation temperatures, presumably. Another area where isoamyl acetate is very noticeable is if you have a contaminated beer. Wild yeast are known for producing these. They're not as tamed as these lab grown yeasts and can produce all kinds of off flavors. One of which is that banana flavor. So again, proper cleaning, sanitation, and then if you want to avoid banana character even in those banana-y beers, maybe ferment a little bit cooler. And that does lead us to the next, we're going to call it an off flavor, but it is also perfectly acceptable in certain styles, which is phenolic and most notably clove, which is caused by 4-vinyl glycol.
Yeah, so I mentioned there were two groups that I don't like calling them off flavors, like oxidation and phenolic, because it doesn't really tell you how to fix the problem.
Right.
Phenolic is that same thing. So like chemically, phenolic is just a benzene ring attached to a hydroxyl group or something like that. So like there's a whole bunch of these, like thousands of these compounds that exist, and I mean there's got to be at least several hundred in beer. So to say, like for example, clove is one very specific phenolic, which is 4-vinyl glycol. I mean, also if you there's also spicy, and that's not necessarily like spicy like capsicum or like hot, but spicy more like, baking spices like pumpkin pie spice, allspice, clove, right. Nutmeg. Cumin is also a good example of a phenolic. That I think cumin is a phenolic. Well, if it's not, right in. I'm pretty sure it is. But like those are sort of those examples. But then you also do get like peppery, right? So peppery is a phenolic, and then some really sort of gross ones at high levels, medicinal, Band-Aid, and smoky are all different phenolic flavor descriptors.
Yes, and I think that's a good point, is that when we're talking about phenolic and focusing just on clove, that is, if you overdo clove, the 4-vinyl glycol, 4VG, in a beer, it will start to take on a very medicinal, like chloroseptic flavor to it. I've had beers that have had that, and it is very unpleasant. But again, there are certain styles. To me, I think of Belgian styles that have a, it is not proper without just a touch of that clovey, peppery characteristic, and it really does contribute a nice, kind of depth to those types of beers. So the flavor threshold for phenolic in general is 0.05 to 0.55 ppm, so kind of a decent range there. Again, common descriptors: clove, peppery, all the way up to medicinal if you overdo it. How is phenolic off flavors? How are they created? The number one way, if you don't want them there, if they're created, again, we said it a million times, is contamination. If you're fermenting with a clean yeast like Flagship or the Chico strain, and you're starting to pick up a phenolic off flavor, that is not supposed to be there. That yeast isn't supposed to be producing that. Chances are you've got something going on with that yeast. If you are using a POF positive yeast strain, so a phenolic, they say off flavor, but a yeast strain that is known to produce this phenolic component, then one way that they say you can accentuate that or push that yeast to produce more of it is by fermenting it cooler. So the opposite of isoamyl acetate.
Yeah, and I'm glad you brought that up, the POF positive strains. That's POF is phenolic off flavor. And so there are a bunch of genes or a bunch of yeast that have a specific gene that produces an enzyme that results in a phenol. Yeah. But yeah, and so that's another way to avoid phenolic off flavors is to use a strain that doesn't produce many phenols, like Chico. That's a strain that doesn't have a whole lot of phenols that it produces. So whether you ferment that hot or cold, you're not going to get a whole lot of phenolic off flavors. Now, if you get crazy, if you get up into the hundreds, you're going to start to get some things that smell like phenols. But again, as long as you're in like normal ranges of fermentation, some strains just aren't going to produce as much. And, like lager strains are a great one. Pastorianus, that's the lager, the basic lager strain, that doesn't produce a lot of phenols, which interestingly, its parent, so it's a hybrid strain of eubayanus and cerevisiae, and its parent is phenolic off flavor positive eubayanus. So it's kind of interesting. So changing your yeast strain can also help you avoid phenolic off flavors.
Yeah. Again, those last two, phenolic and isoamyl acetate, that banana character, are two that it's hard to describe them as off flavors because there are certain styles where you expect those to be. And so we just wanted to put that caveat out there. I thought we'd focus on a couple of the more disgusting off flavors here as we wrap the show up. The first one being isovaleric acid. This is described commonly as old cheese or like rancid oil, that really just gross, stinky, bad, like your oil is turned, it's gone bad. Or some people describe it as sweat. I've had beers that have had this characteristic, and it is, you don't drink these beers. They taste horrible.
Yeah, this one I think is fairly easy for me to say. This one smells awful. Whenever you get an isovaleric acid contamination. So you said sweat. To me, it's like foot sweat and toe jam, like gym socks. Like this is just really nasty, and it comes through a lot. I mean, commonly it's said that it's caused by oxidized hops,
right?
Improperly storing your hops. But an interesting place too that it comes from is Brettanomyces.
Yeah.
So it'll actually come from that version of yeast. If you get a Brettanomyces infection, you can have isovaleric acid or cheesy flavors in certain strains of Brettanomyces. But yeah, this one is a nasty one.
Yeah, and it's one that I've, the times that I've experienced it have been young Brett fermented beers that it ultimately ends up going away, in my experience at least. But when you pull, a sample from a beer that is being fermented with Brettanomyces, well, I forget which strain it was that I was using, you cannot mistake that cheesy, gross, rancid smell. The whole idea behind old oxidized hops, I think, comes from people out there saying that if you leave hops out for too long, that they, exposed to oxygen and in a warm, like on your countertop, that they can take on kind of a cheesy aroma. I could see how that could contribute an isovaleric acid flavor component to the beer, but I don't see how that would actually, convert to isovaleric acid. It just more kind of emulates that aroma. I don't know though.
Yeah, that's a good point. I honestly don't know don't know the chemistry there, but yeah, I think of like the way that hops were stored before we had refrigeration.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, surely these hops were dried to be shipped around the country, but some of them are going to get moldy and nasty and exposed to oxygen. Right.
Right.
But this is, sort of an interesting note about stale hops is even if they do smell cheesy and nasty and they're stale, haven't been stored appropriately, there's a bunch of science or a bunch of research out there that suggests that you can still use those as bittering hops in the boil. So that, like you said, that's kind of interesting that you're not sure how that converts to isovaleric acid. And I wonder if that has something to do with it. If you can boil the hops, maybe that's an opportunity to use these cheesy, stinky smelling hops in your beer.
I would just throw them away. That's how I am. The flavor threshold for isovaleric is 0.7 to 1 ppm. So again, if it's there, you're going to pick it up probably. How can you avoid it? I mean, if it is something that's caused by hops, store your hops in a freezer, keep them out of light, out of the way of light, and do your best to remove the oxygen. I haven't been this is a little secret, insider trading here. I haven't really been using my vacuum sealer on hops as often lately, and I've not noticed any issues with that. I do squeeze the bag. I keep them in the bags that I get from Yakima Valley Hops, and I just squeeze the air out, but I 100% always store them in a freezer. And we know that chemical reactions in general are expedited with heat. The warmer an environment is, the faster a reaction is going to take place. So by storing them in the freezer, you are reducing how quickly that reaction is going to take place. So those are just some tips on that front. Otherwise, again, if it's a contamination issue, then you need to make sure to mind your sanitation. The other, probably, I don't know which one's worse, isovaleric acid or butyric acid. And that is another one that is common, probably most common in sour beer brewing and making, particularly like sour mashing.
Yeah, butyric acid vomit.
Oh my God.
Bile.
It's disgusting.
Rancidity. Yeah, this one, thankfully I have never experienced it out in the wild. I've just encountered it during off-flavor trainings. But yeah, this is most likely a bacterial infection. So this Clostridium bacteria, which is actually in your gut already. You have it in your body. Maybe that's why it smells like stomach bile.
Exactly.
I don't know why I never put that together until just now. But yeah, this one is gross. And if you've ever done a beer tasting, hopefully you've never encountered this in the wild. If you do, it can, since in sour mashing, especially if you're just using whatever, bacteria is on the grain in your sour mash, it could have Clostridium on it, and that could come out and overpower your grain. There are a bunch of steps you can take to sort of prevent Clostridium infection, changing your temperature that you're letting it mash at, controlling it, stopping it, at specific times, also, testing it and tasting it to make sure it doesn't taste like vomit whenever you transfer it to the kettle. Those are, it's a really, really nasty descriptor and a really nasty flavor, but somewhat easily controlled.
Oh yeah, I mean, if you're minding your sanitation and you're not doing sour mashing, which I mean, you hear so much bad feedback on people who've tried to make a sour beer through sour mashing. There's just other methods that are far less, likely to lead to nasty off flavors like butyric acid. But this is a relatively easy one to avoid. I've never made a beer with it, but like you, I have had the Flavor Standard from Flavor Active, and we dosed a pale lager with it, and I absolutely refused to drink it after smelling it. It's, if you've had a baby and you those out there who are parents have absolutely smelled baby vomit, that is exactly what this crap smells like. It is disgusting. Nobody wants a beer with this in it. Flavor threshold for it is 2 to 3 ppm. Again, you can avoid this just by minding that good sanitation practices. Like you, Cade, I've never experienced it in the wild, like in a real beer that I can remember at least. So
yeah, and I mean at Blue Owl we did sour mashing, and never had a Clostridium infection in any of the malt or any of the procedures that we were using. So again, just be mindful if you get something like that in a batch, you need to sanitize all of your equipment.
Yeah,
just cleaning and sanitation will take care of most of those issues.
Yeah, and I feel like I should qualify my. It sounds like I'm hating on sour mashing. I think it's actually a valid way to make sour beer. What I'm saying is most homebrewers that I know who have tried it are sour mashing, in their converted cooler mash tun, and that thing is typically not always the cleanest surface anyways. It's plastic. There's crap that can be in those crevices. There's just a lot that can go wrong on our scale doing that. I've had delicious sour mash beers as well, but it does seem like the commonly cited source of butyric is usually that's one of them at least, is when you sour mash. So all right, the final off flavor we're going to talk about, and this is one that it kind of goes back to oxidation a little bit, but I feel like people often mistake it for other stuff, is sweet. When you drink a beer that is perceptibly too sweet, there's no necessary like prescribed flavor threshold for it. There is a subjective component to it, I believe, because some people may not perceive things as being as sweet as other people might. Common descriptors for this would be like sugary or cloying. You commonly hear the term cloying, candy-like, or syrup.
So this one might be a third category of all flavors that I don't like, but yeah, no, I get where we're going with this one, and I think this one is technically included in any of the BJCP or Cicerone off flavor stuff. Yeah. But yeah, it's that cloying, sugary, flavor. It's that like, oh man, this tastes like unfermented wort, yes. Right? And I think I just hit on one of the things there. That is oftentimes one of the causes of this sweet off flavor is unfermented wort or residual, dextrins that are still in the beer, causing this like over sweetness.
So we've done a number of mash temperature experiments. Now, anyone who's been brewing for any amount of time knows the warmer you mash, right? The higher that temperature that you're mashing at, the less fermentable the wort is that you're creating. So lower mash temps are associated with more fermentable wort. One of the things, and I've been on judging panels where people are writing down this advice really, and it just drives me crazy, is if they drink a beer and it has a perceptible sweetness, they'll write the advice or the recommendation. You need to, mash lower and dry this beer out. It's too sweet. We have done multiple mash temperature experiments that have returned results consistently showing that higher FG is not necessarily related to a perceptible sweetness in the beer. In fact, people struggle to tell apart and cannot reliably distinguish beers that are mashed 10 degrees apart from each other. So that is a tough one for me to swallow. This idea that sweetness is in some way related to the finishing gravity of the beer.
Yeah. And I mean, it may be, right? Like in some cases, you might have a beer that's finishes at, 10:10 versus one that finishes at like 10:30 or 10:40, right? I mean, sweet wort definitely is sweet.
Absolutely.
But yeah, it's that whole deal of, I have probably written this on a number of score sheets myself, which is, you should ferment your beer lower, so that you get rid of some of those additional, dextrins so that you can, you get a more fermentable wort and so a drier finish in your beer. I've probably written that, and that's not incorrect, right? That's based on science. I mean, that's based on research that has shown that that's how that works, that process works. But again, this is a sweetness, and I often sometimes wonder how much this category overlaps with oxidation or some of the other off flavors that we've discussed previously, in that it's just that it's right now serving as a catch-all category for some things that are just, this beer is just way too sugary or way too cloying for the style.
Exactly. I'm going to go over some areas where I think sweetness is expected, that sometimes a beer can get dinged for. I'm going to go over some things that sweetness is caused by that maybe people aren't focusing enough on. One of them is the heavy use of crystal malt. That is a malt that is intended to make a beer taste sweeter for the most part. And so like if you're drinking an amber ale and it has kind of a sweetness to it, then it was likely made with crystal malt, and that's not necessarily an off flavor. You may not like it, right? But that's one area that it can come from. If you're drinking a 10% triple IPA and you get this sweet characteristic when you swallow that beer, alcohol esters are sweet, perceptibly sweet. That would make sense. That is not necessarily an off flavor. And I guess that's the part that I want to focus on, is that candy syrup-like characteristic can come from things that are supposed to be there, And so it doesn't mean that it's not supposed to be there. It doesn't make it an off flavor.
Yeah, exactly. I love that the alcohol piece of this too. So I just had a beer last night from Wayfinder, which is a Portland brewery up here. It was their IPA. It was a fantastic IPA. If you're in Portland, you definitely need to check it out. But it had this alcoholic sweetness to it, and I was able for one of the first times in my life to actually identify that this was alcoholic sweetness. It wasn't just from the malt. Like it was like 7.5% beer, which was perfect. If that beer had been 5.5 or even below 5, the bitterness would have just overwhelmed everything and the hop flavor. But that beer was just so well balanced, and that alcohol sweetness is there serving that purpose. But if that beer, like I said, had been a 9 or a 10% beer, I might not have enjoyed it as much, and it might have been sweet. Not because it was necessarily unfermented wort or it had a bunch of dextrins in it, but because it just had a lot more alcohol, and alcohol is sweet.
Yeah. You made the comment on beers that taste worty, that taste more like wort than they do fermented beer. There are certain yeast strains that don't metabolize maltotriose or maltose as well as other yeast strains, and that can result in that, in my experience at least, in that beer having kind of a wort-like flavor to it. I'm not a fan of it. I know right now a growing trend is making non-alcoholic beers or very, very low alcoholic beers. And there are strains out there that I'm kind of just learning about now that are designed. I mean, these yeasts don't metabolize maltose or maltotriose. So you can make effectively what the claim is that you can make a quote fermented beer that doesn't have alcohol. My experience with some of these craft NA beers is that they just taste like hoppy wort, and that I'm not a fan of it. I think there are other things I'd rather drink that don't have alcohol in it that are, more refreshing at least. But that is one way as well. And so if you cut off fermentation early, you're not letting that yeast finish its fermentation, then yes, you can result in a beer that is perceptibly sweet. I've experienced that myself. Usually, especially if you're bottling, that can result in some pretty scary bottle bombs and stuff, because the yeast is going to want to keep continuing doing its thing. So make sure, if you don't want a perceptibly sweet or gross beer, that you're minding the amount of crystal malt you're using, and that you are making sure that the beer is completely fermented out before you package it.
Yeah, I think those are great strategies for overly sweet wort. The other thing I would look to, and this I think is encompassed in that, is just your recipe design, right? Like make sure that the malts that you're using are going to produce the flavor. Malts and hops and yeast and water are going to produce the flavors that you're actually intending. And if you're not getting that, if you're getting something that's too sweet, you have a lot of options for changing that. Yeast, hops, and malt and water as well. So, I mean, think also about your recipe design if you are getting an overly sugary or cloying beer.
Yeah, absolutely. And final note on the sweet thing, I mentioned it earlier when we were talking about oxidation. I perceive oxidized hoppy beers as being like candy-like sweetness. So that's another place. Usually the oxidation will show itself visibly as well. The beer will start to turn darker. It'll have telltale signs of cold side oxidation as well. So, but that's another thing. If you are perceiving sweet, it may be that. It may not be that there's something else going on that is commonly associated with sweetness. Well, all right, Cade, I think that pretty much sums up our experiences and thoughts on beer off flavors. We went a little bit longer on this episode than we usually do, but I had fun chatting with you about all of these different off flavors. Any last words before we sign off?
Yeah, this was a lot of fun. The one thing I'd tell everybody out there who's listening to this and finds this interesting, if you haven't yet, do an off-flavor tasting. I do them every chance that I get. If I see there's an off-flavor tasting somewhere within a 30-minute drive of my house, I'm going to it. Or if your local homebrew club wants to do it, the flavor standards are fairly cheap when you split it over a number of people. Do this and understand the off-flavors so that you can better describe and better troubleshoot what's going on in your beers.
Couldn't have said it better myself. Don't forget to check out our new podcast, The Brew Lab, where host Cade Jobe takes you into the lab with real brewing scientists to discuss fascinating research they've done on our favorite beverage. And remember, head over to brewlosophy.com to stay current on everything we are up to. The Brewlosophy podcast is made possible by the generous support of our sponsors, as well as all of our rad listeners. We seriously could not do this without you. Cheers to everyone who has subscribed and left a review of our show. It makes a huge difference. If you haven't yet, please consider doing so. Head over to brewlosophy.com/support to view a list of ways you can easily help us to continue producing this podcast. If you want a reward for your support, visit patreon.com/brewlosophy. Thanks again for listening. We'll be back next week with another episode of the Brewlosophy podcast. Until then, think beer.
Start off the morning with some hot tea, lemon and honey, cause it soothes my throat. Put some herb in the bowl, yeah, it's homegrown. Ain't gotta go through the middleman no more.